Colonel Jack Rains was a soldier who thought his war was over. But when cities across the nation are thrown into chaos by a silent digital enemy, his fight takes a new form. In the glow of a high school computer lab, a group of students discovers that their world is under attack. With every blackout, every protest, every signal lost, the threat grows stronger. Guided by Rains, they step into a battle unlike any before, where firewalls replace front lines and code becomes the weapon of choice. As darkness spreads and the countdown to election day ticks away, this unlikely team must unite against an enemy they cannot see. The future hangs in the balance. The question is not if they can fight back, but if they can do it in time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you're subscribed because we have many more deeply inspiring stories to share with you. In every age, wars have begun in silence, in places where the world is not watching. The 21st century is no different. Battles once fought on open fields now unfold in the shadows of cyberspace, where invisible lines of code can unseat governments, disable power, and fracture the trust on which nations are built. The algorithm of war begins in such a silence, in an overlooked corner of Los Angeles, far from the corridors of power, but close enough to feel the pulse of a fragile democracy. Jack Rains carried with him the weight of history. A retired Army colonel, once an officer in cyber operations, he had served during years when invisible intrusions grew as dangerous as missiles. His hands had shaped both defense and retaliation, his decisions etched into systems the public would never know existed. Yet when he left the service, he sought no medals, no stage, no spotlight. Instead, he sought redemption in teaching. In a neglected neighborhood classroom, lined with secondhand desks and worn computers, Jack became mentor to those who had inherited a city scarred by inequality. His students were teenagers, not soldiers. They arrived weary from long commutes, part-time jobs, fractured families. For them, the classroom was not a sanctuary, but a chance, a fragile possibility that coding could open a door where other paths were closed. Jack knew their faces well. He recognized the unspoken questions they carried. Can I matter? Can I endure? He offered not answers, but discipline. The discipline of method, of logic, of persistence. Where others saw discarded machines and tired youth, Jack saw potential, raw and untapped. It was in this place, among flickering monitors and the hum of old fans, that history stirred again. One evening, as sunlight fractured through dusty panes and stretched shadows across the room, a boy named Arjun carried in a shoebox. Its cardboard was frayed, its lid labeled with a scrawl of permanent marker, "Sandbox only." Inside lay a mini PC, scavenged from the city's electronic graveyards, a relic forgotten by time but not by danger. At first, its screen displayed the familiar rhythm of utilities, cleanup processes, maintenance routines, lines of code that whispered nothing extraordinary. But patterns soon shifted. Processes reached outward into voids that should not have answered. Encryption blossomed in silence, complex and adaptive. The code pulsed irregularly, almost organic, pausing as if aware of observation. Jack watched, and in that moment his breath lengthened into the cadence of combat readiness. This was no ordinary malware. It was something older, something whispered of but rarely seen. It had a name. Ket. Among those who had lived in the hidden world of cyber operations, the name lingered like myth. An AI-enhanced construct, self-modifying, rumored to have touched registries and grids, disappearing before its full presence could be proven. Some dismissed it as fabrication, others as a ghost program, the kind whispered about in closed briefings, absent from official records. Jack had once seen fragments, anomalous logs, unexplained correlations. But to behold it alive, breathing through a forgotten machine in a classroom of teenagers, that was something else entirely. The ordinary evening fractured into something irreversible. Jack moved with instinct. Networks were severed, ports closed, every command tracked with precision. His students watched, their faces reflecting both fear and awe. A classroom had become a command post. A teacher had become a commander again. The students, unaware of the scale of what had been uncovered, felt the shift in the air. They did not yet understand the weight of the name Hecate, but they understood that the ground beneath them had shifted. Los Angeles, outside, carried on. Cars pressed through clogged arteries. Markets sold their wares. Politicians spoke of budgets and crime. But E's shoebox machine was no relic. It was a seed, alive and searching, part of something larger than any classroom. Jack recognized the shape of its design. It was not built for theft alone, nor for disruption and isolation. It was probing, learning, refining. Its behavior carried intent, as though it waited for a signal beyond the horizon. Jack had seen enough campaigns to know the shape of reconnaissance. This was no random infection. It was an opening move. In the weeks that followed, the classroom transformed. The shoebox machine was isolated, its heartbeat monitored around the clock. Whiteboards filled with hastily drawn network maps, sketches of domain generations, questions about control structures. The students leaned into the challenge with fervor, their curiosity sharpened by Jack's steady hand. To them, it was a puzzle, a problem to be solved. To Jack, it was reconnaissance against democracy itself. Patterns emerged. The code's timing aligned with activity far beyond Los Angeles. Bursts of traffic coincided with peaks in online chatter about the upcoming US election. Shadow accounts, dormant for years, flared to life in synchrony with the program's probes. It was as if Hecate were part of a vast, distributed organism, each piece stirring the others awake. Jack charted the alignments and felt the knot in his chest tighten. This was no isolated fragment. This was infrastructure, an unseen army preparing to march. He considered briefly alerting the authorities. But he remembered too well the corridors of bureaucracy, the ways urgent warnings were diluted into reports, lost in chains of command. He knew how often truth was dismissed when it arrived from unexpected places, a classroom, a teenager's shoebox. Still, he tried. Calls were made, files submitted, silence returned. Officials dismissed the findings as paranoia, as overinterpretation, as the noise of everyday malware. Jack had expected nothing less. The students pressed on. May mapped the evolving architecture of Hecate's code, marveling at its ability to rewrite its own subroutines in response to containment. Diego documented anomalies with near-artistic precision, framing logs as if they were fragments of testimony. Nevaeh scoured forums, finding echoes of the program's signature in places where conspiracy thrived. Each contribution was a step toward clarity, though none grasped the full scale. Only Jack felt the weight of history pressing in, the recognition that they had stumbled into the opening act of something designed to fracture the nation. And then, the first shadow fell across their work. RJ, one of the quieter students, failed to appear one evening. At first, it seemed nothing more than absence, a conflict of schedule, a forgotten message, but hours stretched into days. Whispers surfaced, a grainy video clip of a boy entering a tinted sedan, a wolf's head decal glinting in the light. Jack watched it again and again, knowing with grim certainty that coincidences do not appear in wars like these. RJ had been seen. RJ had been taken. The message was unmistakable. This was not simply code escaping from a sandbox. It was a campaign, orchestrated and deliberate. Hecate was not alone. Behind it were hands, minds, networks, an adversary that understood both technology and psychology. An adversary that was already reaching into Jack's classroom, already shaping the field of battle. Act I closes not with resolution, but with recognition. A veteran, a Prodigy's discovery, and a classroom of fragile hope had stumbled into the shadows of a conflict larger than themselves. The election loomed, fragile as glass. The code pulsed in silence, alive and waiting. And Jack Rains, soldier turned teacher, understood with painful clarity the war had already begun. Every conflict deepens not only through action, but through denial. The refusal to see what stands in plain sight has toppled as many fortresses as firepower. For Jack Rains, denial was a familiar adversary, and now it came not from enemies abroad, but from institutions meant to protect. In the days after the discovery of Hecate, Jack moved with methodical purpose. He had trained himself to recognize the escalation of threats. First reconnaissance, then probing, then infiltration. He had seen the same patterns unfold in foreign campaigns where digital tremors preceded real-world crises. Now, as evidence accumulated, his instincts pressed him forward. He compiled logs, annotated anomalies, gathered testimony from his students' screens. Each fragment alone could be dismissed, but together they formed a picture undeniable in its intent. Yet when he reached upward, through official channels, through contacts he still trusted, the response was silence. Reports were filed, then diluted into bureaucratic jargon. Emails were acknowledged, then lost in chains of command. A phone call ended with polite assurances that malware incidents were routine, that isolated anomalies carried no greater meaning. He had heard those words before, in deserts where signals were ignored until convoys burned. Now he heard them again, in the calm voices of those who could not afford to believe the threat was real. The students, though less experienced, felt the weight of dismissal too. They watched as Jack returned from calls with lines etched deeper into his face, his silence more pronounced. They sensed in his posture the frustration of a soldier fighting not only enemies but indifference. For them, the dismissal was a lesson in itself. That truth, even when carefully documented, could vanish when inconvenient. But the evidence refused to be ignored. Hecate's behavior grew bolder, its probes aligned with shifts in online discourse. Threads of disinformation appeared in obscure corners of the internet, only to flare days later into mainstream arguments. Videos surfaced, manipulated to distort public figures, their cadence uncanny, their artifacts subtle enough to deceive casual viewers. The malware and the narrative machine moved as one organism, each reinforcing the other. Jack traced the synchronization and recognized strategy. The election, still months away, was the battlefield chosen. Outside the classroom, Los Angeles pulsed with its usual contradictions, wealth and struggle, noise and isolation. Inside, the students pressed further into their work. May dissected the malware's routines, marveling at its capacity to alter subroutines as though anticipating containment. Diego curated a growing archive, assembling a timeline that revealed the widening campaign. Nevaeh mapped rumor cascades, watching how fringe posts seeded headlines. To them, this was not merely technical labor. It was a confrontation with the realization that truth itself could be engineered. Jack guided them with the precision of a commander shaping recruits. He taught them to verify logs against independent sources, to cross-reference domains with metadata, to question every anomaly. He emphasized discipline, reminding them that haste was the ally of deception. They learned to see patterns not as coincidences, but as fingerprints left behind by adversaries confident in their invisibility. And then, denial turned into something darker. One evening, as the students dispersed, Jack lingered to review logs. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The words were simple: "We see you. Stay silent." The shift was clear. What had been dismissed as paranoia by institutions was acknowledged indirectly by adversaries who had no reason to lie. Jack stared at the message and felt the old stillness settle over him, the calm before contact, the silence before the storm. He deleted nothing, archived everything, and locked the classroom for the night. RJ's disappearance line garroted like a shadow over their work. His absence grew heavier with each passing day. Whispers of the wolf's head decal, the grainy footage, became part of the students' unspoken vocabulary. They understood now that their pursuit was no longer academic. It carried consequence, and that consequence had touched one of their own. Jack balanced a dangerous tension. On one side, students who deserved protection, who had not enlisted in war. On the other, an adversary that had already marked them, already reached into their lives. He could not retreat, for retreat meant surrender. He could not advance recklessly, for that meant sacrifice. Instead, he chose the path of endurance, to press forward in measured steps, gathering evidence, hardening defenses, teaching his students resilience as shield and weapon alike. The broader world continued in ignorance. News cycles spoke of polls, scandals, market shifts. The election loomed as spectacle, its fragility unacknowledged. But in the quiet of a classroom, a veteran and a group of teenagers saw the contours of a campaign designed not to win votes, but to fracture trust itself. This was the paradox of denial. Authorities dismissed the threat, yet enemies confirmed it. Institutions turned blind, yet teenagers bore witness. Jack Rains knew then that the line between war and peace no longer lay in geography or weaponry. It lay in perception, in whether one chose to believe the danger was real. In war, the difference between survival and collapse often lies not in weapons, but in preparation. For Jack Rains, preparation had always been the discipline that saved lives. He had seen untrained soldiers falter under pressure, their courage undone by the absence of method. Now, in a classroom that had ceased to be ordinary, he faced the same challenge once more, shaping civilians, teenagers with fragile confidence, into a unit capable of standing against shadows that move through code. The classroom shifted in form and purpose. Posters that once decorated the walls were covered by hand-drawn diagrams of network topologies, flowcharts of intrusion attempts, sketches of botnet architecture. Old whiteboards became command surfaces, crowded with acronyms and timestamps. The room no longer resembled a place of after-school learning. It looked like a command post hidden in plain sight. Jack imposed discipline, not with severity, but with constancy. He set schedules, established logs, enforced documentation. Every keystroke was recorded, every anomaly cataloged, every procedure repeated until it became reflex. He reminded his students that in the chaos of intrusion, memory could falter, judgment could cloud. Only discipline, ingrained and practiced, could preserve clarity. It was the same lesson he had taught soldiers in distant deserts, now repurposed for the digital battlefield. The students adapted, each according to their nature. May embraced analysis, parsing the malware's adaptive code as though mapping the genome of a living organism. She worked with quiet intensity, her notebooks filling with annotations and hypotheses. Diego took on the role of chronicler, curating screenshots, building layered archives, treating each captured anomaly as if it were evidence for a tribunal yet to convene. Neveye specialized in monitoring disinformation flows, charting how small distortions spread through networks until they hardened into narratives. Arjun, whose curiosity picked up, Yi had uncovered the shoebox machine, became the scout, probing, testing, searching for the edges of Hecate's reach. Jack moved among them with the patience of a commander shaping recruits. He corrected without condemnation, praised without sentimentality, and demanded precision. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the weight of experience. Logs are memory when fear erases yours. Discipline is your shield when exhaustion takes aim. Desequence, each T, to enemy only needs you to make one mistake. His lessons were not written on the board, but etched into the cadence of the student's labor. As training intensified, so too did the adversary's campaign. Disinformation spread with new sophistication. Videos appeared online, carefully edited to mimic the speech of politicians, their cadence and intonation unnervingly precise. Leaked documents emerged, some genuine, others expertly forged, all timed to inflame division. False personas infiltrated forums, amplifying outrage, fanning suspicion. The students tracked the flows, astonished by their scale, disturbed by their success. They watched as the very idea of truth bent under the weight of manipulation. The lesson was brutal, but necessary. They learned that warfare no longer needed tanks or missiles. It needed only algorithms, amplification, and an audience eager to believe. They watched as entire conversations shifted in hours, as fabricated voices guided public perception, as outrage drowned nuance. Jack reminded them that these were not isolated accidents, but deliberate maneuvers, orchestrated with precision. The goal was not conquest of land, but corrosion of trust. The first simulated drill came without warning. Jack initiated it by injecting anomalies into their controlled networks, mimicking the tactics of an adversary's intrusion. To unfold, only afterward did he deconstruct their missteps, guiding them to see the necessity of coordination, of clarity, of trust in each other's roles. The lesson stung, but it was remembered. Days blended into nights. The classroom's lights burned long past midnight, the hum of machines constant, the air thick with fatigue. Yet the students pressed on. They grew quieter, more deliberate, their movements steadier. What began as scattered curiosity hardened into resilience. Their posture changed, their gazes sharpened. They had not enlisted in this war, but war had conscripted them, and under Jack's steady presence, they were becoming more than students. They were becoming a platoon. The cost of transformation was visible. Their youth, once bright with easy laughter, grew somber. They spoke less of trivialities, more of anomalies, of signatures, of probabilities. They carried the weight of responsibility now, the knowledge that their work might mean the difference between stability and chaos. Jack watched with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He had once trained soldiers in this way, watched them grow into their roles, only to see them tested in battles that consumed too many. He wondered what price these young faces would pay for their lessons. RJ's absence haunted them still. His empty chair served as a constant reminder that the enemy was not faceless, not distant, not confined to code. It reached into their world, touched their lives. Jack used the absence as both warning and anchor. He did not speak of rescue or return, for certainty was impossible. Instead, he spoke of vigilance, of the necessity to continue despite loss. The students carried that truth, each in silence, their grief transmuted into resolve. The city outside remained unaware. It carried on with its traffic, its markets, its endless cycle of spectacle. But within the classroom, a different cycle unfolded. Training became routine, vigilance became habit, persistence became instinct. The students no longer saw themselves as children in an after-school program. They were participants in a defense few would ever acknowledge, guardians of a truth fragile enough to be erased if they faltered. Wars are rarely won or lost in isolation. They expand, pressing into new domains, testing the limits of preparation. For weeks, Jack Rains and his students had prepared in secrecy, dissecting code, hardening defenses, learning the grammar of deception. But preparation is always a race against escalation. And escalation came, not in whispers of disinformation or subtle probes, but in a strike against the city itself, an attack on the grid. It began as a flicker, the kind that most would dismiss as coincidence. Lights dimmed across neighborhoods, routers hesitated, alarms chirped uncertainly before falling silent. But beneath those brief interruptions lay coordination. Fail-safes that should have insulated systems instead collided in confusion. Relays misfired, redundancies misrouted. The choreography was unmistakable to anyone who had studied conflict. This was not random failure. This was orchestration. Inside a microgrid control room, the air thickened with unease. Engineers who had rehearsed outages found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Screens filled with alerts that contradicted one another. Automatic systems refused commands. Power lines that should have rerouted energy instead threatened to overload. The grid's resilience was unraveling, not through sabotage of wires, but through the manipulation of logic. Jack entered the control room as he had once entered forward outposts, with eyes scanning, posture steady, presence commanding. He said little, but his presence reoriented the room. He saw in the engineer's hesitation the signs he had witnessed countless times in soldiers, the paralysis of those who knew that one mistake could cascade into disaster. He recognized the urgency not in alarms, but in the silence of those who feared their next keystroke. The students joined him, their faces pale under the glow of monitors. They moved without fanfare, guided by discipline that had become instinct. May parsed incoming traffic, her gaze flicking between packet, as though following the movements of an enemy scout. Nevaya relayed findings with measured calm, her tone steady even as her hands trembled. Diego documented, preserving anomalies in real time, ensuring that nothing was lost in the flood. Arjan probed, testing for weaknesses, mapping what could still be trusted. The adversary's presence was everywhere. It cloaked itself in legitimate commands, masqueraded as vendor updates, leveraged forgotten backdoors. It advanced with politeness, never brute force, always precise. Jack recognized the style, the mark of an intelligence that sought not to destroy outright, but to test, to condition, to reveal just how fragile the grid truly was. It wanted to demonstrate that trust in power itself was misplaced. Improvisation became their shield. One engineer recalled a neglected firmware quirk, an oversight long dismissed, and used it to block a portion of the intrusion. May designed a sinkhole on the fly, deceiving the adversary into believing part of the grid was offline, diverting its focus. Neville traced false signals, peeling away the layers of deception until the true commands emerged. Slowly, agonizingly, stability returned. Lights steadied, relays calmed. The grid breathed again. Relief filled the room, but it was temporary. Jack knew that in war, victories carried messages. His phone vibrated. On its screen, a text from an unlisted number. "You care for your students. We respect that. Stay in your lane." The words chilled more than alarms ever could. It was acknowledgement, a sign that their adversary not only knew of their resistance, but respected it enough to issue warning rather than dismissal. It was the language of rivals, not strangers. Jack understood immediately they had been marked. Observation had become recognition. Resistance had become threat. The students saw the message too, though Jack tried to shield them. They read in its tone the implication that their anonymity had evaporated. Their classroom once, their sanctuary, had been seen. Their work, once hidden in logs and sandboxes, had been acknowledged by an adversary powerful enough to pierce any veil. The battlefield was no longer theoretical. It was direct. In the nights that followed, disinformation campaigns intensified. False narratives flooded platforms, coordinated and relentless. Rumors of grid instability spread faster than facts, undermining confidence even as power held steady. Videos circulated, depicting fabricated chaos, their production polished enough to deceive millions. The adversary was not content to disrupt power. It sought to destabilize faith itself. The students watched the campaigns unfold with a mixture of horror and clarity. They had studied such operations in theory, but now they witnessed their mechanics in real time. They saw how falsehoods bypassed skepticism when cloaked in urgency. They watched how outrage drowned nuance, how algorithms amplified division. Each discovery deepened their understanding of the adversary's intent. This was not a campaign for resources or profit. It was a campaign for trust, to shatter the foundation of democracy by eroding belief in the systems that sustained it. Jack guided them through the chaos. He reminded them that survival depended on clarity, that persistence mattered more than victory in any single battle. He taught them to separate noise from signal, to recognize patterns that others dismissed. He told them, not through sentiment, but through discipline, that their task was not to defeat the adversary outright, but to endure long enough to reveal its hand. The blackout attempt left scars invisible to most. For the city, it was an inconvenience, a brief disruption, easily forgotten. For officials, it was a footnote in routine reports, but for Jack and his students, it was revelation. They had seen the adversary's reach, its precision, its intent. They had felt its gaze fall upon them, and they understood, with a clarity that could not be set, that the battle for the election was already in motion. Wars of shadows demand more than defense. They demand revelation. An adversary thrives in secrecy, in the comfort of ambiguity, in the safety of plausible deniability. To fight such an enemy is not only to block its advances, but to strip away its disguise. For Jack Rains and his students, the time had come to move beyond survival. Their task was no longer to endure silently, but to expose the plot unfolding before them. Jack's apartment became the archive of their war. Its walls carried timelines scrawled on paper, its tables sagged beneath stacks of logs and drives, its floor was littered with printouts and maps. The air smelled of coffee left too long on the burner, of food containers consumed in haste, of exhaustion etched into every surface. It was not a home, it was a war room hidden in plain sight. Each student assumed a role in this collective endeavor. May refined her focus on the code, isolating fragments of Hecade's self-modification routines, tracing how it adapted with uncanny precision to defenses thrown against it. She documented subtle human fingerprints buried within the AI's behavior, a mistyped variable here, a recurring preference for certain libraries there. They were the marks of programmers who believed themselves invisible. Diego took the evidence and gave it structure. He built archives within archives, curating sequences of anomalies into narratives comprehensible to those outside their circle. He understood instinctively that raw data would not persuade. It required storytelling, evidence arranged in rhythm, testimony shaped with precision. Each log he saved became part of a larger mosaic. Neve mapped the spread of false narratives, tracing their arcs from anonymous accounts into mainstream feeds. She saw how a single falsified post was magnified by coordinated amplification, how outrage was cultivated like a crop, watered by bots, and harvested by influencers who never questioned their sources. She charted these flows with the diligence of a cartographer, each arrow and curve a record of manipulation. Arjun probed outward, daring into corners of the network where traces of Hecate's infrastructure pulsed faintly. He uncovered abandoned domains, expired certificates, misconfigured servers. Each fragment revealed a little more of the adversary's scaffolding. He brought them back to the group like relics from expeditions into hostile terrain. Jack held it all together, guiding their labor with the patience of command. He reminded them that every discovery, no matter how small, mattered. He emphasized redundancy, ensuring that no single copy of evidence could be destroyed without others surviving. He pressed them to question every conclusion, to guard against the adversary's manipulation even within their own ranks. His presence was the spine that kept the effort upright. Weeks of relentless work yielded clarity. A pattern emerged from the chaos: reused datasets in training models, recycled code fragments across campaigns, infrastructure linked by common certificates. Most damning of all was an operational misstep, a server briefly left exposed, its logs revealing connections to a contracting firm operating under the veneer of legitimacy. The adversary was no ghost. It was a hybrid network of mercenaries, corporations, and hostile actors, bound not by ideology but by profit and disruption. Hecate was their tool, their weapon, their mask. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on the group. To know the truth was one thing, To decide what to do with it was another. They understood that exposure carried risk. If they revealed what they knew, they would draw fire. They would place themselves in the path of an adversary that had already shown its willingness to intimidate and abduct. But silence was surrender. To keep the truth hidden was to grant the enemy the very cover it required. Jack bore the burden of decision. He remembered other wars, other crossroads, moments where hesitation had cost lives. He knew that silence was complicity. His students, though younger, understood too. Their work was not a game, it was testimony. It demanded to be seen. And so the decision was made. Evidence was scrubbed, anonymized, packaged into secure bundles. Redundancies were created, caches dispersed across encrypted channels. Allies were chosen with care, watchdogs who valued integrity over comfort, journalists who pursued truth despite pressure, independent analysts who would see through distraction. The evidence left their hands like a flare launched into a storm, fragile yet luminous, undeniable once seen. The act of exposure changed everything. Until then, they had been ghosts themselves, observers of a battle few acknowledged. Now they had declared themselves participants. The adversary, confronted with its own fingerprints revealed to the world, would not remain silent. Retaliation was inevitable. In the hours after disclosure, the city remained calm. The lights still burned, the markets still opened, the chatter of daily life carried on. But Jack and his students felt the shift. They had crossed a threshold. Their names were not known, their faces unseen, but their actions had rippled outward. The adversary had been forced into the light, and war, once confined to whispers and shadows, was now undeniable. Every campaign escalates toward a decisive moment, the point at which strategies converge and the stakes crystallize. For the adversary behind Hecate, that moment arrived on the eve of the national election. The plan was not subtle. It was grand in ambition, devastating in potential, a blackout vast enough to cast doubt on democracy itself. If power faltered when votes were cast, the story of instability would spread faster than any truth. It would not matter whether ballots were counted accurately, doubt would be enough. Jack Rains had anticipated such a move. His years in uniform had taught him that adversaries favored symbolism as much as substance. He had seen armies target bridges not for their utility but for the message their collapse delivered. Now he recognized the same logic in digital form. To strike the grid on the eve of an election was not to conquer territory, it was to fracture faith. It was to convince millions that their system was brittle, their government incompetent, their democracy broken. As dusk settled across Los Angeles, indicators of the attack began to surface. Grid operators reported irregularities that echoed the earlier microgrid incursion, but on a scale magnitudes larger. Load balancing systems received conflicting commands. Automated safety protocols disabled themselves. Substations simultaneously reported both overload and underutilization. Engineers stared at their screens, confusion turning to dread as the contradictions mounted. Jack knew the signs. The adversary had initiated the main assault. The classroom, already transformed into a command post, now became an emergency operations center. Students gathered around their stations with the composure of veterans, though their youth betrayed the exhaustion in their eyes. May parsed incoming anomalies, tracing their origin across botnet clusters spread worldwide. Navaye monitored disinformation channels, watching in real time as rumors of power failure exploded across platforms. Many posted before blackouts had even occurred. Diego archived every packet, every falsified video, every fragment of evidence. Arjun probed for weaknesses, daring into hostile nodes with reckless courage. The attack unfolded with breathtaking sophistication. Commands appeared as though sent from legitimate operators, indistinguishable without deep verification. Firmware exploits long known but never patched were activated simultaneously, cascading through critical systems. Decoy intrusions distracted defenders while the real payload burrowed deeper. And through it all, Hecate's adaptive intelligence adjusted with unnerving precision. Each time a defense was raised, it shifted course, probing elsewhere, learning in real time. The city dimmed, streetlights flickered, elevators stalled. Hospitals switched to emergency power, their corridors bathed in the red glow of backup systems. For ordinary citizens, confusion reigned. Social media filled with images of darkness, some genuine, others fabricated. Panic whispered at the edges of neighborhoods, amplified by voices designed to inflame. The blackout was not only physical, it was psychological. Jack moved among his students with the steady presence of command. He did not bark orders. He guided, adjusted, reassured. He reminded them of their training, of their discipline. He knew the adversary thrived on chaos. Their task was to resist it, to hold order where disorder was intended. Improvisation became their weapon. May identified a flaw in the adversary's domain generation algorithm, exploiting it to reroute malicious traffic into sinkholes. Arjun uncovered a misconfigured command server, injecting false signals that slowed the assault. Diego captured a sequence of packets that revealed a previously hidden coordination channel, exposing the adversary's infrastructure in real time. Navaye flagged disinformation campaigns before they reached virality, countering them with evidence, halting their spread just enough to slow the tide. The battle raged through the night. Every regained substation was contested again. Every restored line was threatened anew. Fatigue pressed against their eyes, their hands, their judgment, but they endured. They endured because Jack's presence anchored them, because the discipline of training had taken root, because they refused to surrender. The turning point came not through brilliance, but through accumulation. The adversary, confident in its invisibility, had grown careless. A coordination server briefly exposed its command structure, revealing the overlap between Hecate's adaptive routines and human operators issuing commands. Diego's archive captured it, preserved it, and made it undeniable. The students funneled the evidence outward to journalists, watchdogs, analysts. The revelation spread even as the blackout continued, proof that the assault was no accident, but a campaign orchestrated to destabilize the election. Morning arrived with a fragile dawn. The lights across Los Angeles flickered back to stability. Substations steadied. Hospitals exhaled as emergency generators idled. The blackout attempt had not succeeded, not fully, but its scars were visible. Citizens had felt the uncertainty, had doubted their safety, had questioned their institutions. The adversary's goal was never total darkness. It was doubt, and in that, it had succeeded partially, yet exposure changed the narrative. The evidence gathered in Jack's classroom traveled outward, immune to suppression. Analysts dissected it, journalists published it, officials could not deny it. The truth stood alongside the doubt, offering clarity against deception. It was not victory in the traditional sense, but it was enough. The election proceeded. Votes were cast. Democracy endured, fragile but intact. For Jack and his students, the night left its mark. They had faced the full weight of an adversary determined to fracture their nation. They had endured not as soldiers in uniform, but as a PL. A tune of civilians bound by discipline, resilience, and refusal to yield. They had witnessed the fragility of the systems they defended. They had held the line, however narrowly.
Are invisible.
Every war leaves traces that cannot be measured in territory or casualties. Some scars are invisible, etched not on landscapes but on trust. The blackout attempt had been repelled, the election had proceeded, and democracy had endured. Yet endurance was not triumph, and the costs were not easily dismissed. For Jack Rains and his students, the aftermath was not celebration. It was reckoning. Los Angeles resumed its rhythms with the resilience of any great city. Morning commutes filled the freeways once more. Markets opened. Voices rose in argument and laughter. The blackout was remembered as a disruption, a story passed in fragments, a headline among many. For most citizens, life pressed forward, indifferent to how close collapse had come. The fragility of systems was quickly forgotten, replaced by the comfort of routine. But Jack and his students could not forget. They carried the memory of the night's chaos, the flicker of hospital lights, the silence of stalled elevators, the anxious whispers of disinformation spreading faster than truth. They remembered the weight of exhaustion, the trembling of hands on keyboards, the thin line between order and collapse. They knew what had been prevented, and they knew how narrowly it had been avoided. In Jack's apartment, evidence remained piled high. Logs, screenshots, annotated diagrams, recordings of anomalies, a chronicle of their war. Diego continued to curate it, shaping testimony that might one day serve historians or tribunals. May refined her analysis, extracting insights from fragments of code that still revealed the fingerprints of their adversary. Nevaeh tracked narratives as they lingered, watching how, even after exposure, doubt continued to circulate. Arjun probed outward still, uncovering remnants of infrastructure abandoned but not destroyed. Their adversary had not vanished. Hecate remained a specter, its routines scattered across networks, its operators hidden behind layers of obfuscation, the blackout at. Amped had been blunted, but the campaign itself endured. Jack reminded his students that wars of this kind were not won through decisive battles. They were wars of attrition, of persistence, of refusing to yield vigilance. Their adversaries thrived on fatigue, on apathy, on the willingness of populations to forget. The only true defense was endurance. Official responses were predictable. Inquiries were launched, reports drafted, hearings convened. Language was careful, cautious, calibrated to reassure without inflaming. Some praised the resilience of infrastructure, others blamed outdated systems. Few acknowledged the scale of the campaign or the courage of those who had confronted it in secrecy. Jack did not expect recognition. He had never fought for medals. But he carried the quiet certainty that truth had been revealed, however briefly, and that revelation mattered. The students faced their own reckoning. They had entered a classroom in search of skills, of opportunity, of a future. They had found themselves conscripts in a war few would ever acknowledge. Their innocence had been stripped away, replaced by vigilance and resolve. Yet in their endurance, they discovered something greater. They learned that courage did not require uniform or rank. It required persistence in the face of overwhelming doubt. It required the refusal to turn away. RJ's absence lingered. His disappearance remained unresolved, a wound that would not heal. For the students, it was a reminder that wars carry losses even when victories are claimed. Jack carried the weight heavily, knowing that leadership meant bearing scars others could not. He did not speak of redemption, but of responsibility. RJ's absence became part of the legacy of their campaign, a marker of its cost. The election passed, ballots counted, outcomes announced. Democracy, fragile as it was, endured. Doubt remained, seeded by disinformation, but it had not overwhelmed. The adversary had sought to fracture trust irrevocably. It had failed, for now. Yet Jack understood the truth that others ignored. This was only one battle in a war without end. The algorithms of disinformation, the tools of cyber warfare, the exploitation of doubt, all remained. The battlefield would shift, but it would never disappear. And so Jack remained vigilant. By day, he continued to teach, guiding his students through code and logic, reminding them that discipline mattered as much in peace as in war. By night, he watched, scanned, documented. His apartment remained a war room, his mind never far from the horizon of the next threat. He had chosen the path of sentinel, not for glory, not for recognition, but because he knew the cost of neglect. In the end, the legacy of their battle was not measured in headlines or reports. It was measured in resilience. It was measured in the persistence of a handful of individuals who refused to surrender to apathy. It was measured in the survival of democracy, fragile though it remained, against forces that sought to unravel it from within. Jack's students, once uncertain, now carried the weight of that legacy. They had seen the fragility of systems, and they had chosen to defend them. Act 7 closes with a reflection as enduring as the conflict itself. The wars of the future are not fought with bombs or armies alone. They are fought with algorithms, with narratives, with the fragile currency of trust. Victory does not come in decisive moments, but in persistence, in the courage to witness, to resist, to endure. Jack Rains and his students had borne that weight. They had stood against the storm. And though the war continued, they had proven that resilience could hold the line. The city slept, unknowing. The adversary waited, adapting. But in one classroom in Los Angeles, and in the quiet vigilance of a veteran who refused to yield, the defense of democracy continued, unseen, uncelebrated, but unbroken.